Hello, I'm Trish. I'm an Australian and I live in the UK. I love Ellen Montgomery, but I've never read Emily, so we are going to read this chapter together for the first time. Chapter 13, A Daughter of Eve. New Moon was noted for its apples, and on that first autumn of Emily's life there, both the old and the new orchards bore a bumper crop. In the new were the titled and pedigreed apples, and in the old the seedlings unknown to catalogues, that yet had a flavour wildly sweet and all of their own. There was no taboo on any apple, and Emily was free to eat all she wanted to, of each and every kind, the only prohibition being that she must not take any to bed with her. Aunt Elizabeth, very properly, did not want her bed messed up with apple seeds, and Aunt Laura had a horror of one eating apples in the dark, lest they might eat an appleworm into the bargain. Ugh. Emily, therefore, should have been able to satisfy her appetite for apples at home, but there is a certain odd kink in human nature, by reason of which the flavour of apples belonging to someone else is vastly superior to our own, as the crafty serpent of Eden knew very well. Emily, like most people, possessed this kink, and consequently thought that nowhere were there such delicious apples as those belonging to Lofty John. He was in the habit of keeping a long row of apples on one of the beams in his workshop, and it was understood that she and Ilse might help themselves freely whenever they visited that charming, dusty, shaving-carpeted spot. 3 varieties of Lofty John apples were especial favourites: the scabby apples, that looked as if they had leprosy but were unsurpassed deliciousness under their queer blotchy skins; the little red apples, scarcely bigger than a crab, deep crimson all over and glossy as satin, that had such a sweet nutty flavour; and the big green sweet apples that children usually thought the best of all. Emily considered that day wasted whose low descending sun had not beheld her munching one of Lofty John's big green sweets. In the back of her mind, Emily knew quite well that she should not be going to Lofty John's at all. To be sure, she had never been forbidden to go, simply because it had never occurred to her aunts that an inmate of New Moon could so forget the beloved old family feud between the houses of Murray and Sullivan, belonged to 2 generations back. It was an inheritance that any proper Murray would live up to as a matter of course. But when Emily was off that wild little Ishmael and Ilse, traditions lost their power under the allurement of Lofty John's reds and scabs. She wandered rather lonesomely into the workshop one September evening at twilight. She had been alone since she came from school. Her aunts and cousin Jimmy had gone to Shrewsbury, promising to be back by sunset. Ilse was away also, her father, prodded thereto by Mrs. Sims, having taken her to Charlottetown to get her a winter coat. Emily liked being alone very well at first. She felt quite important over being in charge of New Moon. She ate the supper Aunt Laura had left her on the cookhouse dresser. She went into the dairy and skimmed 6 lovely big pans of milk. She had no business to do this at all, but she'd always hankered to do it, and there's not a good chance to be missed. She did it beautifully, and nobody ever knew, each aunt supposing the other had done it, and so she was never scolded for it. This does not point any particular moral. Of course, in a proper yarn, Emily should have been found out and punished for her disobedience, or driven by an uneasy conscience to confess. But I'm sorry, or ought to be, to have to state that Emily's conscience never worried her about the matter at all. Still, she was doomed to suffer enough that night from an entirely different cause to balance all her little peccadilloes. By the time the cream was skimmed and poured into the big stone crock and well stirred, Emily didn't forget that either. It was after sunset and still nobody had come home. Emily didn't like the idea of going alone into the big, dusky, echoing house, so she hired herself to Lofty John's shop, which she found unoccupied. The plane, halted midway on the board, indicated that Lofty John might be working there quite recently, and would probably return. Emily sat down in a round section of a huge log and looked around to see what she could get to eat. There was a row of reddened scabs clean across the side of the shop, but no sweet among them. and Emily felt that she needed just then was a sweet and nothing else. Then she spied one, a huge one, the biggest sweet Emily had ever seen, all by itself on one of the steps of the stairs leading up to the loft. She climbed up, possessed herself of it, and ate it out of hand. She was gnawing happily at the core when Lofty John came in. He nodded to her with a seemingly careless glance around. "Just been to get my supper," he said. "Wife's away, so I had to get it myself." He fell to planning in silence. Emily sat on the stairs and counting the seeds of the big sweet. You told your fortune by the seeds. Listening to the windwind whistling elfishly around the knot in the loft, and composing a description of Lofty John's carpenter's shop by lantern light, to be written later on a letter bill. She was lost in a mental hunt for an accurate phrase to picture the absurdly elongated shadow of Lofty John's nose in the opposite wall, when Lofty John whirled around so suddenly that the shadow of his nose shot up like a huge spear to the ceiling, and demanded in a startling voice, "What's become of the big sweet that was on the stair?" "Why, I ate it," stammered Emily. Lofty John dropped his plane, threw his hands up, and looked at Emily with a horrified face. "Saints preserve us, child! You never ate that apple! Don't tell me you ate that apple!" "Yes, I did," said Emily uncomfortably. "I didn't think it was any harm. Harm? Listen to her, will you? The apple was poison for the rats. They've been plaguing the life out of me, and I had me mind up to have them finish their fun. And now you've gone and ate the apple. It would kill a dozen of you in a brace of shakes." Lofty John saw a white face and a gingham apron flash through the workshop out into the dark. Emily's first wild impulse was to get home at once, before she dropped dead. She tore across the field, through the bush and the garden, and dashed into the house. It was still and silent and dark. Nobody was home yet. Emily gave a bitter little shriek of despair. When they came home, they would find her stiff and cold, and black in the face. Likely, everything in the dear world ended for her forever. All because she'd eaten an apple which she thought she was perfectly welcome to eat. It wasn't fair. She didn't want to die, but she must. She only hoped desperately that someone would come along before she was dead. It was so terrible to die there all alone in that big, empty new moon. She dared not to go anywhere for help. It was too dark now. She'd likely drop dead in the road on the way. To die out there alone in the dark, that would be too dreadful. It did not occur to her that anything could be done for her. She had thought if you once swallowed a poison, that was the end of you. With hands shaking in panic, she got a candle lighted. It wasn't quite so bad then. You could see things in the light. And Emily, pale, terrified, alone, was already deciding that this must be faced bravely. She must not shame the stars and the Murrays. She clenched her cold hands and tried to stop trembling. How long would it be before she died, she wondered. Lofty John had said the apple would kill her in a brace of shakes. What did that mean? How long was a brace of shakes? Would it hurt to die? She had a vague idea that poison did hurt awfully. Oh, a little while ago she'd been so happy. She thought she was going to live forever and write great poems and be famous like Mrs. Hemans. She had had a fight with Ilse the night before and hadn't yet made it up. Never could make it up now. And Ilse must feel so terribly. She must write her a note and forgive her. Was there time for that much? Oh, how cold her hands were. Perhaps that meant she was dying already. She had heard or read that your hands turned cold when you were dying. She wondered if her face was turning black. She grasped her candle and hurried up the stairs to the spare room. There was a looking-glass there, the only one in the house hung low enough for her to see her reflection. If she tipped the bottom of it back, Emily would have been frightened to death at the mere thought of going to that spare room by dim, flickering candlelight. But the one great terror had swallowed all the lesser ones. She looked at her reflection amid the sleek black flow of her hair, in the uplight striking light of the dark background of the shadowy room. She was pale as death already. Yes, that was a dying face. There could be no doubt of it. Something rose up in Emily and took possession of her. Some inheritance from good stock behind her. She ceased to tremble. She accepted her fate, with bitter regret, calmly. I don't want to die, but since I have to die, I'll die as a Murray, she said. She had read a similar sentence in a book that came pat to the moment, and now she must hurry. That letter to Ilse must be written. Emily went to Aunt Elizabeth's room first to assure herself that her right-hand top bureau drawer was quite tidy. Then she flitted up the garret stairs to the dormer corner. The great place was full of lurking, pouncing shadows that crowded around the little island of faint candlelight. But there were no terrors for Emily now. And to think I was feeling so bad today because my petticoat was bunchy, she thought. And she got one of her dear letter bills, the last one she would ever write on. There was no need to write to father. She would see him soon. But Ilse must have a letter. Dear, loving, jolly, hot-tempered Ilse, who just the day before had shrieked insulting epithets at her, and who would be haunted by remorse for the rest of her life for it. Dearest Ilse, wrote Emily, her hand shaking a little, but her lips firmly set. I am going to die. I have been poisoned by an apple Lofty John had put for rats. I will never see you again, but I'm writing this to tell you that I love you, and you're not to feel bad because you called me a skunk and a bloodthirsty mink yesterday. I forgive you, so do not worry over it. I am sorry that I told you you're beneath contempt, because I didn't mean a word of it. I leave you all my share of the broken dishes in our playhouse, and please tell Teddy goodbye for me. He'll never be able to teach me how to put worms on a fish hook now. I promised him I would learn because I did not want him to think that I was a coward, but I am glad I did not, for I know now what a worm feels like. I do not feel sick yet. I don't know what the symptoms of poisoning are, and Lofty John said there are enough to kill a dozen of me, so I can't have long to live. If Aunt Elizabeth is willing, you can have my necklace of Venetian beads. It is the only valuable possession I have. Don't let anybody do anything to Lofty John, because he did not mean to poison me, and it was all my own fault for being so greedy. Perhaps people will think he did it on purpose because I am Protestant, but I am sure he did not. Please tell him not to be haunted by remorse. I think I feel a pain in my stomach now, so I guess the end draws nigh. Farewell, and remember her who died so young. Your own devoted Emily. A beautiful letter. Emily folded up her letter bill. She heard the sound of wheels in the yard below. A moment later, Elizabeth and Laura Murray were confronted in the kitchen by a tragic-faced little creature, grasping a guttering candle in one hand and a red letter bill in the other. Emily, what is the matter? Cried Aunt Laura. I'm dying, said Emily solemnly. I ate an apple Lofty John had poisoned for rats. I only have minutes to live, Aunt Laura. Laura dropped back on the black bench with her hand at her heart. Elizabeth turned pale as Emily herself. Emily? Is this some play acting of yours? She demanded sternly. No, cried Emily quite indignantly. It's the truth. Do you suppose a dying person would play acting? Oh, Aunt Elizabeth, please will you give this letter to Ilse? And please forgive me for being naughty. I wasn't always naughty when you thought I was. And don't let anyone see me after I'm dead if I turn black, especially Rhoda Stewart. By this time, Aunt Elizabeth was herself again. How long has it been since you ate that apple, Emily? About an hour. If you'd eaten a poisoned apple an hour ago, you'd be dead or sick by now. Oh, cried Emily, transformed in a second. A wild, sweet hope sprang up in her heart. There was a chance for her after all. Then she added despairingly, but I felt another pain in my stomach just as I came downstairs. Laura, said Aunt Elizabeth, take this child out to the cookhouse and give her a good dose of mustard and water at once. It will do no harm, and it may do some good. If there's anything to this yarn of hers, I'm going down to the doctor's. He may be back, but I'll see Lofty John on the way. And Aunt Elizabeth went out. Aunt Elizabeth went out very quickly. If it had been anyone else, it might have been said she ran. As for Emily, well, Aunt Laura gave her that emetic in short order, and 2 minutes later Emily had no doubt at all that she was dying then and there, and the sooner the better. When Aunt Elizabeth returned, Emily was lying on the sofa in the kitchen, her face as white as a pillow underneath her head, and as limp as a faded lily. "Wasn't the doctor home?" cried Aunt Laura desperately. "I don't know. There was no need of the doctor. I don't think there ever was from the first. It was one of Lofty John's jokes. He thought he'd give Emily a fright, just for fun. His idea of fun." "March you off to bed, Miss Emily. You deserve all you got for going over to Lofty John's at all, and I don't pity your particle. I haven't had such a turn in years." "I did have a pain in my stomach," wailed Emily, whom fright and mustard water combined had temporarily extinguished her spirits. Anyone who eats apples from dawn to dusk can expect a few pains in her stomach. "You won't have any more tonight, I reckon. The mustard will remedy that. Take your candle and go." "Well," said Emily, getting unsteadily to her feet, "I hate that dod-gartered Lofty John." "Emily!" said both aunts together. "He deserves it," said Emily vindictively. "Oh, Emily, that dreadful word you used." Aunt Laura seemed curiously upset about something. "Why? What's the matter with Dodgarsted?" said Emily, quite mystified. "Cousin Jimmy uses it when things vex him. He used it today. He said that Dodgarsted heifer had broken out of the graveyard pasture again." "Emily," said Aunt Elizabeth, with the air of one impaling herself on the horns of the dilemma, "your cousin Jimmy is a man, and men might use expressions in the heat of anger that are not proper for little girls." "But what is the matter with Dodgarsted?" persisted Emily. "It isn't a swear word, is it? And if it isn't, why can't I use it?" "It isn't a ladylike word," said Aunt Laura. "Well, then I won't use it any more," said Emily resignedly. "But Lofty John is Dodgarsted." Aunt Laura laughed so much after Emily had gone upstairs that Aunt Elizabeth told her a woman of her age should have more sense. "Elizabeth, you know it was funny," protested Laura. Emily being safely out of sight, Elizabeth permitted herself a somewhat grim smile. "I told Lofty John a few truths. You're not going telling children they're poison again in a hurry," left him fairly dancing with rage. Worn out, Emily fell asleep as soon as she was in bed, but an hour later she awakened. Aunt Elizabeth had not yet come to bed, so the blind was up, and Emily saw a dear friendly star twinkling down at her. Far away the sea moaned alluringly. Oh, it was nice to be alone and to be alive. Life tasted good to her again. Tasted like more, as Cousin Jimmy said. She could have a chance to write more letter bills and poetry. Emily already had yards of verses entitled "Thoughts of One Doomed to Sudden Death." And play with Ilsa and Teddy. Scour the barns with Saucy Sal. Watch Aunt Laura skim cream in the dairy and help Cousin Jimmy in the garden. Read books in Emily's bower and trot along the Today road, but not visit Lofty John's workshop. She determined that she could never have anything to do with Lofty John again after his diabolical cruelty. She felt so indignant for him for frightening her, yet they had been such good friends too, that she could not go to sleep until she had composed an account of her death by poison of Lofty John, being tried for her murder and condemned to death. He's being hanged on a gibbet as Lofty's himself. Emily being present at that dreadful scene in spite of the fact that she was dead by his act. When she had finally cut him down and buried him bleakly, the tears streamed down her face out of sympathy for Mrs. Lofty John. She forgave him. Very likely he was not Dodgarsted after all. She read it down a letter bill in the garret the next day. What a delightful adventure. Thank you.